The airport was crowded that day, as it always was. Passengers rushed through the terminals, their voices a mix of excitement, impatience, and weariness. The young woman moved through the throngs of people with ease, her eyes scanning the signs above, guiding her toward the security checkpoint. She had just wrapped up a business trip and was eager to return home. The feeling of being back on familiar ground was comforting, but she couldn't shake the fatigue that clung to her after days of traveling. She had done this 1,000 times before. Checked in, gone through security, boarded the plane, and finally made her way home. This routine had become second nature to her. But today something felt off. Maybe it was the extra hustle in the air, the sense of people rushing to get to their flights, or perhaps it was the tiredness that made her more sensitive to her surroundings. She approached the security checkpoint, her heart slowing as she prepared for the usual process. She had her ID and boarding pass ready, like always. She didn't expect any delays or issues. After all, she was just another traveler in the crowd, following the same rules and procedures as everyone else. But as she stepped up to the conveyor belt to place her belongings into the bins, an officer suddenly stepped forward. He wasn't one of the usual staff she had encountered in the past. He was a bit older, a little more stern in his expression, his uniform a little more worn. Something about him struck her as odd, though she couldn't quite place why. "Ma'am, can I see your ID again?" the officer asked, his tone brisk. The woman, taken aback but still composed, nodded and handed it over without hesitation. She had nothing to hide, after all. But as she handed it to him, she noticed the way his eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle, almost imperceptible change in his demeanor. It wasn't just routine anymore. He glanced down at her ID, then up at her, and then back at the card. His expression changed, his eyes sharpened, and a sense of suspicion seemed to fill the air. He looked her over, inspecting her in a way that made her feel uncomfortable even though she had done nothing wrong. "You look like you're in a hurry. Why the rush?" he asked, though it didn't seem like a question. It sounded more like an accusation. She blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift. She had seen officers do this before, briefly checking someone's ID, running it through the system, maybe asking a couple of routine questions. But this was different. This officer was scrutinizing her, looking for something or perhaps trying to provoke a reaction. She felt her stomach tighten. "I'm not rushing," she replied, her voice steady. "I just finished a business trip and I'm heading home." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he handed back her ID and motioned for her to continue forward. But just as she thought the ordeal was over, he stepped in front of her. "I need to conduct a more thorough search," he said, his voice colder now. The woman's heart skipped a beat. A thorough search? This wasn't normal. She had been through airports countless times and had never been pulled aside like this, especially without any explanation. She tried to remain calm, telling herself that it could be a misunderstanding, that maybe there was a reason for it that she wasn't seeing yet. She glanced around. People were still moving through the checkpoint, oblivious to what was happening. The officer's colleague at the scanner didn't seem to take notice, continuing with their work without a second glance. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice firm but controlled. The officer's eyes hardened. "I said I need to conduct a search." The woman took a deep breath, trying to assess the situation. Something wasn't right. She had been searched before, but this felt different. The officer's attitude, his body language, it all seemed off. She wondered if anyone else had noticed the way he was treating her. But there was no turning back now. He was in charge, and she knew that resisting could make things worse. "I'm happy to cooperate," she said, her voice a little softer now. "But could you please explain why this is necessary?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, he gestured for her to step aside, away from the crowd. As she moved to the side, she felt the eyes of a few nearby passengers on her, their gazes lingering. The officer, clearly in charge of the situation, waved off any concern, indicating that they should go on with their business. It was as if this was just another part of the daily routine for him, another person to intimidate, another suspicious individual to deal with. Once she was out of the way of the main flow of passengers, the officer's attitude seemed to change. His voice became louder now and his tone harsher. "I'm going to need to pat you down," he said, his eyes cold as he sized her up. "You look suspicious, like you're trying to hide something." Her mind raced. Suspicious? She wasn't doing anything wrong. She had followed every rule, every procedure. but she could feel the pressure building inside her, a knot forming in her stomach. She was trying to stay calm, but the more the officer's words hung in the air, the more she felt like she was being singled out for no reason at all. "I'm really just trying to get to my flight," she said again, her voice quieter now. "I've been through this process hundreds of times before." But the officer wasn't listening. Instead, he stepped forward, uncomfortably close, and motioned for her to raise her arms. At that moment, a small group of people who had been watching the scene started to look more closely. The woman felt their gazes, some sympathetic, some curious, but most filled with confusion. Why was this happening? Why was she being treated like this when she had done nothing wrong? But the officer didn't seem to care about any of that. He was determined to complete his search without considering the possible consequences of his actions. As his hands moved toward her, the woman's body tensed, her mind racing. This wasn't just a simple check. It felt more like an attack, a way of showing power over her. And in that moment, she realized something that made her blood run cold. She was being treated this way because of the color of her skin. It wasn't just the officer's cold demeanor or the unnecessary aggression. It was the way his suspicion seemed to grow, based purely on an assumption that she didn't belong, that she wasn't like everyone else. And that was something she wasn't willing to accept. The tension in the air thickened, and she knew that this moment would define everything that came next. As the officer's hands moved toward her, the young woman felt the weight of the situation settle heavily on her shoulders. She stood still, trying to remain calm, but every nerve in her body was on edge. She had traveled countless times, always following the rules, but now, for some reason, she felt as if her presence was being questioned in a way that went beyond ordinary security procedures. It wasn't just about the search anymore. It was about something deeper, something uncomfortable, something she had experienced in small, subtle ways before but had never had to confront so directly. She looked around, feeling the eyes of the few people still milling about in the terminal. Some stared at her with curiosity, while others seemed uncomfortable with what was happening, though none spoke up. No one said anything to the officer. She couldn't help but feel the sting of isolation, alone being treated like this, and no one standing in solidarity with her. But as she braced herself for what she thought would be another routine search, something unexpected happened. The officer paused, his hand just inches from her arm. He looked at her again, his gaze more intense this time. She could see that his suspicion was deepening, but there was also something else, an almost visible shift in the air. It was as if he had just remembered something important. Without warning, she spoke, her voice steady but firm, the words coming out almost instinctively. "I work for the FAA." The officer froze, his eyes widening slightly. The shift in his posture was subtle, but it was noticeable. He had been so sure of his actions just moments before, but now there was a brief hesitation. The woman, still standing tall, kept her eyes locked on his. "I'm an employee of the Federal Aviation Administration," she repeated, this time with more certainty. "I know the protocols for security, and I'm asking you to explain why you're singling me out like this." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The officer's expression seemed to shift again, from suspicion to confusion. It was clear that her revelation had thrown him off balance. He stepped back slightly, his eyes scanning her face as if weighing the words she had just said. The woman stood her ground, watching him closely. Her position in the FAA wasn't just a job. It was a key part of her identity. She knew the procedures, the rules, and the rights of passengers going through airport security. She was familiar with the training that security officers received, and she knew, without a doubt, that she had been treated unfairly. She had spent years working to ensure that others were treated with respect and dignity in these same situations. She couldn't let this moment slip by without confronting it. The officer still didn't respond immediately. His eyes moved back to her ID, still clutched tightly in his hand as if trying to make sense of her words. A flicker of recognition seemed to cross his face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He wasn't sure how to proceed now that he had encountered someone who knew the rules better than he did. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize," the officer mumbled, but the woman could tell that his apology was more out of obligation than genuine remorse. He hadn't apologized for his actions. He had simply been caught off guard. The tension in the air remained thick, and the woman could feel it pulling at her. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, but she wasn't going to let this man dismiss her. He had crossed a line, and now she was going to make sure he knew it. "Do you realize what just happened here?" she asked, her voice quieter now but no less firm. You assumed I was a threat based on nothing but my appearance. That's not how this works. You don't get to treat me like this just because I look different. The officer's expression faltered, and for a split second, the woman thought she saw something akin to guilt flicker across his face. But it was fleeting. Instead, he seemed to return to his original position, trying to regain some control of the situation. Well, I'll need to call in a supervisor, he said, though there was no real authority behind his words. The woman could see right through him now. He was trying to backpedal, but the damage was done. She nodded, her expression calm but resolute. Please do. I want this addressed right now. As the officer walked away to radio for a supervisor, the woman stood still, trying to collect her thoughts. She was shaking, but not with fear. It was more a mixture of disbelief and anger at how quickly things had escalated. How had it gone from a simple security check to this? She knew why. She could feel it in her bones. It was because of her skin, because of the assumptions he had made before she even opened her mouth. The minutes felt like hours as she waited for the supervisor to arrive. She could still hear the sounds of the airport around her, the murmurs of other passengers, the whooshing of luggage being rolled down the aisles, the announcements over the PA system. But her focus remained on the officer and the situation unfolding before her. She had worked hard to get to where she was in life, and now standing here being treated with suspicion, it felt like a slap in the face. When the supervisor finally arrived, she wasted no time explaining what had happened. She could see the difference in the way the supervisor carried himself. He was calm, professional, and most importantly, he didn't seem as quick to judge. He listened to her account of the situation without interrupting, nodding occasionally. There was a stark contrast between the way the officer had treated her and the way the supervisor was handling the matter. I'll make sure this is looked into, the supervisor said, his tone apologetic, though his words didn't feel as if they would offer any real resolution. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. The woman forced herself to take a deep breath. It's not about inconvenience, she replied. It's about respect and fairness. This shouldn't have happened in the first place. The supervisor, perhaps realizing that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding, nodded again. I understand. We'll get this straightened out. The officer, still standing off to the side, said nothing. The woman could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't look back. She didn't need to. As the supervisor walked away to make a report, the woman stood there, still reeling from the confrontation. She had expected an uncomfortable experience, but not this. Not the assumption, not the aggression. It was as if her mere presence had been seen as a threat. She knew she couldn't let it slide, not this time. She had to stand up for herself, not just for her own dignity, but for anyone who might face the same treatment. For a moment, she allowed herself to take a deep breath, closing her eyes briefly as the weight of the situation hit her, but only for a moment. Then she straightened her shoulders and moved forward. She had a flight to catch after all, and she wasn't going to let anything or anyone stop her. The airport had calmed down a little since the confrontation. Passengers were still rushing to their gates, and the usual hum of the terminal filled the space. But for the young woman, everything felt different now. She could still feel the weight of what had happened, like a storm cloud hanging over her. The officer's eyes, his cold demeanor, the way he had assumed she was a threat, it was all still fresh in her mind. But now, things had shifted. The supervisor had promised to look into the matter, though she didn't trust that it would be resolved as easily as he made it sound. After all, it was just her word against his, and the officer had already proven himself to be more concerned with his authority than with fairness. She was no longer just a traveler passing through. She was a person who had been singled out, treated differently, and she was determined to make sure it didn't go unnoticed. As she made her way to the gate, her phone buzzed. It was a message from one of her colleagues at the FAA. The woman had informed them of what had happened as soon as the situation had calmed down, and her colleague had offered support, letting her know that she wasn't alone. They were all backing her up, ready to help in whatever way they could. But the message was more than just words of comfort. It was a call to action. Her colleague had suggested they report the incident officially, not just to the airport but to higher authorities within the FAA. If this officer's actions were left unchecked, it could set a dangerous precedent. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure that no one else would have to experience the same mistreatment. She sat down at the gate waiting for her flight to board. She felt a mix of exhaustion and anger. Part of her just wanted to forget the whole thing, to get on the plane and go home. But she knew she couldn't let it go. She was determined to make sure this was addressed, not only for herself but for the countless others who might have been subjected to the same kind of bias. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert. The story of the incident had already made its way onto social media. A couple of passengers who had witnessed the altercation had posted videos of what had happened. In the blink of an eye, the situation had gone viral. News outlets were picking it up, sharing the details of the incident along with the woman's side of the story. She felt a wave of emotions wash over her: pride, fear, and a deep sense of resolve. On one hand, the attention meant that the officer's actions would be scrutinized. It was hard to ignore something once it was out in the open, but on the other hand, she knew that going public meant she was exposing herself in ways she hadn't planned for. There was no going back now. Her name, her story, were out there for everyone to see. As her flight finally boarded, she couldn't help but feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. She knew that some were probably just curious, while others were likely wondering what had really happened. She didn't care what they thought. She had done what she needed to do. Now she had to trust that the truth would come out. When she landed, she was met with a flood of messages, calls and texts from friends, family, and colleagues. The story had spread quickly, and everyone had something to say about it. Some were supportive, applauding her for standing up for herself, while others expressed shock and anger at what had happened. Her phone buzzed nonstop as she made her way to baggage claim. Each notification a reminder of the reality she was facing now. She walked through the terminal, trying to stay focused, trying not to let the weight of everything bear down on her. She had made it home, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The incident at the airport was just the beginning. She had been wronged, and now it was time to take action. That night, she sat down to draft a formal complaint, outlining everything that had happened in as much detail as she could remember. She knew that the more information she could provide, the better. This wasn't just about personal revenge, it was about making sure the officer's behavior was addressed, that he was held accountable for his actions. She couldn't let it slide. She knew that this complaint would set the wheels in motion for an investigation, but she was ready. If this officer thought he could get away with his actions, he had another thing coming. She was determined to see this through no matter how long it took. The next day, she submitted her complaint to the FAA, along with the details of the incident and the videos that had surfaced online. The response was swift. Her superiors expressed their support for her, assuring her that they would stand by her and take the matter seriously. But it wasn't just the FAA that was paying attention now. The incident had sparked a wider conversation about racism and bias in airport security. With news outlets covering the story and interviewing experts on the issue, the pressure was mounting, and the attention from the media and the public only intensified the need for action. The officer involved in the incident was placed on leave as the airport conducted its own internal investigation. But the woman knew that internal investigations could be slow, and often nothing came of them. She couldn't just rely on the airport to handle it, so she took the next step. She reached out to a lawyer who specialized in civil rights cases, explaining the situation and asking for advice on how to proceed. The lawyer, sympathetic to her cause, agreed to take on the case. The moment she spoke with him, she knew she had made the right choice. He was confident, determined, and well-versed in the laws that protected people in situations like hers. The legal team began preparing for a potential lawsuit, focusing on the officer's actions and the way they had violated her rights. But it wasn't just about the officer. It was about the systemic issues that allowed him to behave this way in the first place. The lawsuit would not only seek justice for the woman, but also demand that the airport make changes to its policies and practices to ensure that this kind of thing didn't happen again. As the days went by, the woman found herself in a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and media appearances. The pressure was intense, but she remained focused. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for anyone who had ever felt the sting of prejudice or discrimination. The media coverage continued, and the woman's story resonated with people across the country. She received messages from people who had faced similar experiences, sharing their own stories of bias and mistreatment. It was overwhelming at times, but it also fueled her resolve. She wasn't just a victim, she was a symbol of strength, of resistance, of the fight for fairness and equality. And through it all, she never lost sight of what mattered most, making sure the officers' actions were not allowed to go unnoticed, not allowed to stand without consequences. She knew that if she didn't stand up, no one else would. This was her fight, and she wasn't about to back down. The days that followed were a blur for the young woman. Her life had shifted in ways she hadn't expected. What had begun as a routine airport security check had now turned into a full-blown legal battle, one that was receiving more attention by the day. The officers' actions had sparked a wave of conversations about racial profiling and discrimination in public spaces, and now it seemed like everyone had an opinion about it. At first, she was unsure about what the future would hold. She had never imagined herself in this kind of situation, but now that she was in the thick of it, she couldn't back down. She couldn't allow herself to be silenced. This wasn't just about her. It was about making sure that other people, whether they worked in aviation or were just regular travelers, didn't have to experience the same kind of mistreatment. The lawsuit had been filed, and the airport had already begun its internal investigation, but as she knew all too well, internal investigations often took longer than expected, and the outcomes weren't always what people hoped for. The officer had been placed on administrative leave, but that didn't feel like enough. She wanted him fired. She wanted him to face consequences for his actions, not just be put on a break while the system worked behind closed doors. She had seen that happen too many times before. Her legal team had been working tirelessly, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and preparing to take the matter to court. It was a long and grueling process, and every day brought a new wave of stress. She was constantly on the phone with her lawyers, signing documents and providing statements. It felt like she was constantly reliving the worst moment of her life. But she knew that this was necessary. If she didn't keep pushing, nothing would change. The media continued to cover the story. News outlets were still reporting on the incident, analyzing it from every angle. The story had become bigger than she had ever imagined. The video footage from the security checkpoint had been shared widely, with people from all over the country expressing their support for her. Some even compared her to other figures who had stood up against injustice, though she didn't see herself as a hero. She was just someone who had been wronged and was trying to make sure that the same thing didn't happen to anyone else. As the public conversation about the incident grew, the pressure on the airport intensified. People were demanding accountability. The hashtag #DarJusticeForHer began trending on social media, and rallies were organized in support of her cause. She was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, but it also brought a sense of responsibility. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was a movement. It was about calling out systemic issues and ensuring that no one would be treated like she had been. Amid all the chaos, there was one moment that stood out. She had received a call from a woman who worked in the same industry, though not at the FAA. The woman had seen the news and reached out to share her own experience. She told the woman that she had been subjected to the same kind of treatment at an airport several years ago, discriminated against, questioned without cause, and made to feel like she didn't belong. But back then, she had just swallowed her pride and accepted it. She hadn't spoken out. Hearing the woman's story left the young woman speechless. It hit her hard because it reminded her that she wasn't the only one. There were countless others who had been treated unfairly, but many of them had stayed silent for fear of retaliation, or because they didn't think anyone would listen. The woman's story strengthened her resolve. She knew that she had to keep going, not just for herself but for all the people who had suffered in silence. She couldn't back down now. She had a chance to make a real difference, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. Meanwhile, the airport's internal investigation dragged on. The officer was still on leave, but there were no signs that any real action was being taken. She had expected as much. The system was slow to respond, and even though public pressure was mounting, it was hard to know whether the airport would take real steps to address the issue or just sweep it under the rug. Her lawyer had been in touch with the airport's legal team, pushing for a resolution, but it seemed like the airport was trying to avoid a confrontation. They offered a settlement, a sum of money in exchange for dropping the case. It was tempting, but the woman knew it wasn't about the money. It was about justice. She had been wronged, and she wasn't about to let them buy her silence. She refused the settlement. It was a turning point in the case. She was ready for whatever came next, even if it meant facing a courtroom. The idea of taking the officer and the airport to court was daunting, but it was also empowering. She wasn't afraid of standing up for herself anymore. She wasn't afraid of challenging the system that had allowed this to happen. She was ready to make sure that her experience wouldn't just be swept under the rug. The case began to gather steam as more people came forward with their own stories. Other passengers who had been at the airport that day, who had seen the altercation unfold, contacted the legal team. They wanted to share what they had witnessed, to help back up the woman's version of events. Some of them had even taken photos and videos during the incident, though many had been hesitant at the time. They hadn't known what was going on. But once the story hit the news, they realized just how significant it was. It wasn't just the witnesses from that day who were speaking out. The woman began receiving messages from people who had experienced similar treatment at airports all over the country. They shared their own stories of being racially profiled, of being made to feel like criminals without any cause. Some of them had even been subjected to physical searches like she had been. They all felt the same way she did, helpless, angry, and unsure of where to turn. The woman began to realize that this was bigger than her own experience. It was about a much larger issue, about the way people of color were treated in public spaces, especially by those in positions of power. It was about the racial bias that often went unchecked in places like airports, where security officers had the authority to make snap judgments and act on them without any real accountability. She had become a voice for these people, whether she had asked for it or not. And while she never sought fame or recognition, she began to understand the importance of her role in all of this. She had to keep going. She had to keep pushing for change, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been hurt by the same system. The pressure on the airport was building. Public outcry continued to grow, and eventually the airport announced that it would be implementing new training programs for all security personnel. They would focus on racial sensitivity, cultural awareness, and de-escalation techniques. It wasn't the outcome she had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. It was clear that the airport had realized that the situation couldn't just be swept under the rug any longer. The officer, still on leave, was facing an internal review, but the woman knew that the road ahead would be long. She had won a small victory, but there was more work to be done. She wasn't finished yet. She wasn't going to stop until the officer faced real consequences for his actions, and until the system was changed to prevent this from happening again. The long months that followed were filled with uncertainty, but the young woman never wavered in her determination. She had already fought too hard to let the officer's actions go unpunished, and now, after everything that had happened, she knew she had to keep pushing for change. The case was still ongoing, and despite the attention it had drawn, the outcome was still unclear. But she refused to be discouraged. As the days passed, the pressure on the airport continued to build. The media hadn't stopped covering the story, and more people were speaking out. The movement had grown far beyond what she had imagined, with people from all walks of life joining in to demand justice. Support poured in from social media, with people using their voices to call for accountability. The hashtag, Justice for Her, remained trending for weeks, and rallies were being organized in cities across the country. At the same time, the legal battle continued. The woman's legal team worked tirelessly to gather evidence, prepare witnesses, and build a case that would hold the officer and the airport accountable. The woman was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained from the stress of it all, but she kept going. This wasn't just about the officer anymore. It was about the system, about the way people like her were treated, about the systemic racism that still existed in too many parts of society. She knew that if she didn't see this through, nothing would change. One day, she received a call from her lawyer. The tone of his voice immediately told her that something important was happening. "We have an offer," he said, his voice measured. "The airport is willing to settle." She had been expecting this. The airport had been quiet for weeks, but now they were offering a financial settlement, hoping that she would take the money and walk away. They offered a sum of money that seemed significant, but the woman knew it wasn't about money. It never had been. She didn't want a check. She wanted justice. She wanted the officer held accountable for his actions, and she wanted to make sure the airport would take real steps to change its policies. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "Tell them I'm not interested in their money. I'm interested in real change. Her lawyer didn't hesitate. Understood. We'll move forward. The decision wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when she wondered if walking away with the settlement might be the easier option. But every time she thought about it, she remembered why she had started this fight. She remembered how the officer had treated her, how his actions had been rooted in assumptions based on her race, and how she had stood there, powerless, unable to stop it. She couldn't let that happen again. As the case moved forward, the airport began to feel the heat. The legal teams continued to prepare for court, and the media continued to cover every development. The public was invested now, and they wanted answers. The pressure was mounting, and she could feel it. She was no longer just a woman fighting for herself. She was the face of a larger movement, a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. A few weeks later, she received another call. This time, it was from the airport's legal team. They were ready to negotiate. This wasn't a settlement offer anymore. It was a real chance to address the issue. The woman listened carefully as they laid out their proposal. They were offering to make changes to their security protocols, to implement new training programs for all staff, and to review their practices for racial bias. It wasn't exactly what she had wanted, but it was a start. The offer also included a commitment to take disciplinary action against the officer. The woman took a long time to think it over. It wasn't the perfect resolution, but it was progress. It was a sign that things were changing, even if slowly. She knew that the fight wasn't over, but this was a significant step forward. She agreed to the terms of the proposal, knowing that it was the best chance to create lasting change. The news broke shortly after. The airport had agreed to a settlement that included the new policies and disciplinary actions against the officer. The public reaction was mixed. Some felt it wasn't enough, while others felt that it was a step in the right direction. But for the woman, it was a hard-won victory. She had fought for justice, and she had achieved something important. The officer would face consequences for his actions, and the airport would be forced to take a hard look at its practices. But the woman knew that the work didn't stop there. The case had become a catalyst for change, but the larger issues of racial bias and discrimination were still very much alive. She began speaking out more, sharing her story with others and advocating for policies that would help prevent incidents like hers from happening in the future. She worked with organizations that focused on civil rights, using her experience to fuel their efforts to bring about change. She also continued to receive messages from people who had faced similar experiences. They shared their own stories of being discriminated against, of being treated unfairly by security personnel, and of feeling powerless in the face of authority. Some had been racially profiled, others had been subjected to unnecessary searches, but they all shared one thing in common. They had been made to feel like they didn't belong. The woman listened to each of their stories, offering support and encouragement, and using her platform to bring attention to their struggles. Months passed, and the airport began to implement the new training programs. They focused on racial sensitivity, unconscious bias, and de-escalation tactics. It was a long process, but the airport knew that they had no choice but to follow through. The case had made it clear that they could no longer turn a blind eye to the issues that existed within their security operations. While she couldn't change the past, the woman knew that she had made a difference. The officer had been held accountable, the airport had implemented new policies, and the conversation about racial discrimination in airports had reached new heights. She had been part of something bigger than herself, a movement that was pushing for real, meaningful change. As the dust began to settle, the woman found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. She thought about the fear she had felt in that moment at the airport, the uncertainty of the days that followed, and the support she had received from people across the country. It had been a long and difficult journey, but it had also been one of personal growth. She had learned to find her voice, to stand up for what was right, and to never back down in the face of injustice. In the end, the victory wasn't just hers. It was for everyone who had ever faced the same kind of bias, for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than they were. The fight wasn't over, but the young woman knew that she had played a part in making the world a little bit better, a little bit more fair. And for her, that was enough.